Now that we understand a bit about the board, let's take a look at the pieces which populate the board. We're going to take a look at pieces one at a time, starting with the pawns. As you can see, pawns populate both the 7th and the 2nd rank of the board, and they act as buffers, or you could consider it a protective layer protecting the major and minor pieces from their opponent. The basic rules of pawns is that pawns can move one space. There are a few exceptions to the rule of pawns being able to move one. The first exception is the first move of every pawn can be done by moving forward 2 spaces. Now, like I said, this has to be the very first move that the pawn makes. For example, you can't move this pawn up 1 and then decide, oh, I just want to move it 2. So after you've moved this 1, this pawn can now only move 1 space at a time throughout all of its remaining moves. A pawn has to be in its home position to be able to be moved 2 spaces. For example, this g-pawn can move from g2 to g4 because it hasn't moved yet. However, this pawn on e4 cannot move forward 2 to e6 because it's already moved, and it must move only 1 space to e5. The same thing if you had a pawn that had only moved 1 space instead of 2. It's not always advantageous to always move your pawns 2 spaces. In the case of this c3 pawn, this c3 pawn has already moved, so it has lost the right to move 2 spaces. So from the next move that this pawn could make would be from c3 to c4, and then from c4 to c5, and so on and so forth. So pawns can only move 1 with the exception of their very first move where they can move 2. For example, this pawn can move from d2 to d4. It's a perfectly good move and perfectly legal. The first special rule about pawns is how they capture. Pawns capture pieces diagonally. Although they move in a straight line forward and they cannot move backwards, pawns actually capture on a diagonal. So for example, if black were to move their pawn to c5 as such, this d4 pawn could potentially capture it by moving diagonally, like this. While this nets white an extra pawn, as black can't recapture this immediately, this has also fractured white's pawn structure. And when we talk about pawns in more depth, you'll understand the different types of pawn structures and the different types of pawn weaknesses, one of those being a doubled pawn. The last special rule about pawns is a special pawn capture, and this is called the rule of en passant, which in Italian means in passing. And this goes back to the traditional rules of chess. Back in the 15th and 16th centuries, pawns were only able to move 1 space and not 2. The Italians, who modernized the game, changed that rule to allow pawns to move forward 2 to help speed the game up and to stop blockade or blocked positions from occurring so much in the game. But this came with a problem. What can happen is pawns can very easily create these locked type of positions which are extremely hard to crack and can lead to a very uninteractive and not very fun game for anybody that's really involved. So what they did to address that is they created the rule of en passant, or in passing. So let's put a new board up. So for whatever reason, and this is a theoretical position, let's say we do a couple moves and we get into a position where black is to move here and black were to move this pawn from d7 to d5. This is an activation of the en passant rule. If your pawn is ever on the 5th rank, so you can see here's 5, a5. Now for black, the 5th rank would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 right here. So for black that would be the 4th rank. For white this would be the 5th rank. If we were to get into a position that looks like this, where we have a white pawn on the 5th rank, and black were to move their pawn up to create this blocked type position, this activates the rule of en passant. For one turn and one turn only, after black moves d5 from d7, white has the option of actually taking, like so. And this is perfectly legal, although it looks very awkward. And we do that because, as we said, the Italians modernized the game to make it a little bit more action-packed and a little bit quicker. This is to allow white to be able to resolve the tension in the center as if the pawn was only able to move 1, even though it moved 2. So that's to address that change in the rule from being able to move 1 square to 2 squares. Now, if white does not make the decision to take after the first move of this pawn going from d7 to d5, the en passant rule ceases to take effect. Because, going back and thinking of the old rules, the pawn would move 1, white would decline the capture, and then on the second turn, black could move here, and that would have been perfectly legal under the classical rules, and en passant wouldn't have been an option because the pawn move is congruent to the classical rules of the game. So to review the use of pawns, like we said, the first move of every pawn can be either 1 or 2 spaces. Oftentimes in the beginning of the game we see one of the 2 center pawns moved out because it captures space in the center and it helps facilitate the development of their pieces, etc. So pawn movement and control of the center is extremely important. We'll talk about that more a little bit later on in the program. As we discussed, pawns can only move forward and they can never ever move backwards. For example, if a pawn were to move from a2 to a4, they would not be able to then go from a4 back to a3 because that's not necessary. That's not the rule of how the pawns move. This is also an important lesson when we're teaching new players, or be very careful when you're moving your pawns because you're making an extremely committal decision. If black happens to move their knight, like so, and the knight gets attacked, the knight can easily move back to its home square. Not saying that that's the best move, but it's certainly possible. However, if black were to overextend a pawn, or if white were to overextend a pawn, where, let's say for example, this e5 pawn was just sitting out by itself, white can never say, oh no, my piece is out too far, and then pull it back to a safer square on their side of the board. So understand that pawn moves are very committal and they cannot be taken back.